Welcome, and in this lesson, we're going to learn how to interrupt the boot process in order to gain access to our system. We're actually going to do this and reset our root password. So we're going to go under the assumption that for some reason our root password has changed. We either had a disgruntled employee or our system was compromised. Now, the thing about this is that we have to physically be able to be in front of our machine. It either has to be a physical machine or a virtual box virtualized machine. Unfortunately, linuxacademy.com lab servers don't grant you access to the grub boot menu, and that's how we have to modify or interrupt the boot process in order to gain access to the machine. So if you don't have access to that, be sure that you memorize this process. It's actually really easy, so just make sure you watch this video a few times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and reboot my system. You can either turn your system on or just reboot it. And so I'm going to reboot my system. Now, what I need to do here is our boot menu is going to appear. So I'm going to press any key and it's going to interrupt that default countdown to auto select. I want to make sure I highlight the kernel that I want to boot into, and I'm going to press the E key in order to edit our grub configuration. That's essentially what we're doing here. Now let's think about part of our boot process. We turn on our system where our BIOS or EUFI boots up, hands the process over to grub. So what happens is grub allows us to select the kernel that we want to load. But when we select that kernel needs to be loaded somewhere, because we don't by default just have a disk device that magically mounts the disk. What happens is in order to mount our root device disk, we need to initialize services and mount it. So our grub menu, grub configuration allows us to load a local kernel inside of our memory. That kernel has a version of systemd. It has a version of our root device that we're going to mount. And what happens, it goes through the process of mounting and attaching our disk drive. It mounts our future root device as /sysroot in our initramfs as sysroot. And it's located in this memory section, and this memory section is called initramfs. As soon as initramfs goes through booting all of this process, it hands over to the initialization process for our local disk, also creates our process ID one for init, and continues the boot process where it starts all of our services. So what we're going to do is we're going to break into that. We're going to interrupt that boot process, and we're going to get into the initramfs debug shell, which is basically working in memory. So I'm going to go ahead and browse down to my Linux 16 line. I'm going to hit my end command. I'm going to append the command rd.break. This is going to essentially enter us into a specific mode inside of our initramfs debug shell. And to continue, I'm just going to hit Control X, and it's going to continue the boot process into our initramfs debug shell. Now, what happens here is we're essentially inside of our initramfs. Inside of here, we have a directory called sysroot. We also have a directory called root. Now, I'm in my root, and if I hit ls here, we see contents that don't really resemble what's going to be our root device when our boot process completes. In fact, it doesn't resemble it so much, we don't even have the password command to use. So because our contents or our root device is actually mounted as sysroot, or the contents of what will be our root device are mounted as sysroot, because through the initram process, once it's completed booting, it takes the contents of sysroot and mounts it as the root directory when we go into the final boot process of our system. So what I need to do is I need to make sure that we mount that as our root device using a command called changeroot. The sysroot is also mounted as read-only. So let's go through our steps here. Our first step is to remount using mount-o, remount option. We want to remount our sysroot directory as read-write, and I'm going to specify sysroot. So we have mount-o for options, remount, read-write options for the sysroot. Now that we've done that, I want to mount my sysroot directory locally as my root directory. The reason I want to do this is because I want to be able to use my password command. I want to be able to edit the contents of my etc password file. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm actually going to navigate into my sysroot directory. Inside of here, you see that we have an etc directory. If I go into etc, I can ls, and we'll see our password or passwd file. That's the file that our password command is going to change. So in order to mount our sysroot directory as our root directory in what's called a local jail, we're going to use a command called change root. This is pronounced many different ways. Sometimes it's called chai root or cha root or ch root. The command actually means change root, so I'm just going to pronounce it as change root. And I'm going to change root into the sysroot directory. So the /sysroot directory is now acting inside of my shell process here, is now acting as my root directory, which gives me access to then use my password command. You see, I just typed in password. I can either type passwd space root to manipulate the root password, or if I type passwd, you can see it's also doing it as the root user. So I'm going to type in my new password. And now that I've done that, you would think that we're complete. But here's one of the things about working inside the initramfs shell. We have not loaded SE Linux yet. And by default, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7 or CentOS 7 are using SE Linux. So when we modified our etc password file by using our passwd command, we actually changed the context of SE Linux. Now, our context on our files tell SE Linux who has permissions to view and execute certain items. If you're not familiar with SE Linux context, you can go down to the SE Linux section of this Red Hat Enterprise course and learn more about it. So what we need to happen is we need to relabel all our files, which includes the etc password file, when our system boots up next. Now, in order for our system to be instructed to relabel if it skipped it once, we just have to make sure a file exists. That file is inside of the root directory. It's a hidden file, so it's a dot, and it's called auto relabel. If that file exists, then SE Linux will be instructed during the boot process to relabel all of our files. If we don't do this, our password change would have not been successful. So I'll make sure that that file exists. I'm going to exit my change root environment, and I'm going to exit my initramfs shell, and it's going to reboot my system. I'm going to open up a terminal and su into root. And I'm going to put in my new password, and it has my new password there. So I didn't need my root password in order to change it because I broke into it, and basically I changed the contents of our root environment by updating the etc password file inside of the sysroot directory. So let's just go through this process one last time real quick, step by step. We explained what's happening. Now let's just breeze through it and make it happen as a quick exercise. I'm going to interrupt my process. I'm going to edit the grub menu item that I want to boot into. I'm going to browse down to Linux 16, hit N to append on the rd.break command to my Linux 16 kernel line. Hit Control X, which will boot me into my initramfs shell now that I entered that rd.break. From here, we need to make sure that we mount our sysroot directory as read-write. So I'm going to do an option. I'm going to remount it with read-write permissions, and that's the sysroot directory. I'm going to change my root to create a root environment based off of my sysroot directory. I'm going to then use my passwd command to change the root password. In order to ensure that this works and SE context rereads and relabels everything, in order to ensure that this works and SE Linux relabels all of the SE context or contexts of files, I need to touch the auto relabel file inside of my root directory. We'll hit enter. I'm going to exit from my change root environment, exit from my initramfs shell, and then wait for it to reboot. And that completes the process. So that concludes it for this lesson. Go ahead and complete this lesson and move on.